everybody and welcome to my video. It's lovely to have you here joining me in my new studio. This is the first video I've done in here and it feels pretty good. I've decorated it a little bit for Christmas, which looks great. This video that you're watching right now is going to be all about 4 main tasks for you to do as warm-ups before you start painting. It's a bit of a grey miserable day, so excuse the harsh lighting, but it's perfect for painting, so let's get started. Well, everybody grab a coffee or a drink or something like that and we'll get into the video. I just wanted to show you why it would be great for you to do a warm-up. It's good practice as an artist to do this before you start painting. Number one, it gets your creative juices flowing, which is brilliant, so it makes you feel good. Number two, it boosts your confidence, which is super important. You usually create your best work if you're feeling confident in yourself. Number three, absolutely no rules involved here whatsoever. So therefore there's absolutely no pressure on you to produce a fantastic piece of work, and it gets you much more playful, and that you'll find that things that work, maybe some things don't work, but that's fine too. There's no pressure. And number four, probably most importantly, mistakes don't matter here, okay? So it's completely guilt-free painting, and that's what we all want. So let's get started. So the first exercise I'm going to go through with you is to play with 2 different colours. So I have a sin mix of crimson on my palette and also a little bit of cerulean blue. Just going to have a little play and see how they react together and see if we like the way they mix and things on the page. So I'm going to start off with the crimson. I've loaded my brush up. As you can see here, I've got 4 sections on my watercolour paper. I've just sectioned them off using just ordinary painter's tape, which is a little less damaging on the paper. So I'm just going on to dry paper here. I'm just going to pick up quite a bit of that crimson. And I'm just playing. There's, like I say, there's no rules here. I just want to see what happens with these 2 colours. I'm going to start in this side. Bit of crimson there. Maybe sort of drag some colour across using the tip of my brush. And maybe puddle some up as well here. So I'm just dabbing my brush on the surface and allowing some paint to drop down onto the paper. So as soon as you touch the surface, that paint is drawn off the brush. And next I'm going to pick up a different brush with the cerulean blue. I'm just going to touch some of this. I'm just using the tip of my brush and allowing, in some areas, allowing it to touch the crimson. So let's get some colour down here. I'm going to leave some of the white of the paper because I quite like that. Bring some of this together. Going for some more of the cerulean blue. It's quite a thick mix here. I've added some water to my dried paint that's in my palette and I've let it activate the paint, and now I've got a nice creamy thing. See how it's just touched there and it's drawing that crimson in, which is really nice. Allow it to touch in a couple of places and up here. See how they merge together. And actually, while it's wet, I'm going to have a go at just tilting the board a little bit and allow some of that paint to move about. So you can tip backwards and forwards, left and right, and just see what happens. So the mixture is quite fluid, so it's allowing it to spread across the surface really nicely. I'm getting some lovely mixes happening naturally on the surface without me having to do any work, which is always great, and I quite like that. So I'm going to actually pick up the cerulean blue again, and let's just dab in some puddles into the crimson. Just bring it down a bit more as well. I quite like that mix of purple that it's creating, that's nice. So just playing about really. I've not got any preconceived ideas here. I don't want quite so much white paper now, so let's go back to the crimson. A little bit thicker paint. Oh, that's lovely. See how that straight away wants to merge with the blue there. So this is a thicker mix of paint here on my brush than what I used originally, because I've gone straight back into my palette rather than into the pre-mixed paint that I made. So this is a lot thicker consistency, and it's going to overpower the watery mix that's already on the surface, so that's why it's pushing it out of the way and splaying, so that works really nicely. That's fab, I like that. So this is working really well. And let's have a little go at tipping again. Just, you can see these beautiful little lines emerging. It's really pretty. So I could never create this effect with my brush, and it's only by playing that you realise actually what can be achieved just by having a go, not being self-conscious about it, and just seeing what happens. So I'm going to take my paper towel now and just rub away at the edges, just to remove that paint off the edge there. Because what happens if you leave the paint on the edge is as it's drying, it draws back into your work, and you end up with kind of cauliflower type shapes being created. And that's fine, in some instances you might want that, but here I want to leave it as it is. I might give it a very, very quick squirt with my water and just see what happens there. For this next warm-up, we're going to have a little bit of a play with different colours and see how they bleed together and work together. So I have some colours already mixed on my palette. These are colours that I don't often use in my painting, so therefore I'm not quite sure how they're going to react together. So this is a great time to play about with those and find some new colour combinations that might work well in my paintings. So I have turquoise, permanent magenta, permanent rose, dark Zazine violet and sap green. And I'm just going to use circles. It's a really quick and easy little warm-up to do. Let's start off with a sap green, and I'm just going to do a circle here in this corner. Load up my brush a little bit more. So I'm working on dry paper again. With this warm-up you need to work quite quickly so that this paint doesn't have time to dry before we go into the next colour. So let's see how that mixes with the permanent magenta. So you can do this with any colour combination, you don't need to use these colours at all. So I'm just going to do my circle first. You can use any kind of shape. Circles are quite easy to do, so that's what I like about them. They're quite organic. And just before I finish, I'm just going to touch the tip of my brush against the green and allow that to mix together on the surface. And I quickly move on to the next colour. let's go for the turquoise this time. I'm interested to see how this might work with the purple. Well, it's magenta, isn't it? So let's just see how these work together. So I've just touched that there. And the two paints are still wet on the surface, so it'll slowly but surely in front of your eyes bleed together. And let's go for the rose this time. Let's get a bit more paint, because the rose is quite a pale colour. It's not very powerful, not very strong, so to use a lot of pigment in that so that the blue doesn't overpower it too much. Just touching it there. Doesn't seem to want to move much. Let's try a bit more of a touch. Oh, we'll see what happens. Moving on to the final colour. So this is the dioxazine violet. Let's see what happens here. So I'm going to bring this colour in right here. I'm going to try and touch it to the green, see if it will actually... The green might have dried too much to do anything. And the same with the permanent magenta there, but let's hope it does something nice with that pink, that rose. So obviously the dioxazine violet, very powerful, very strong colour. It is starting to blend with the rose. What you can do is go back into the colour, perhaps put a bit more on in that area. Let's see what happens. Put a bit more next to that blue as well. Let's go back into the turquoise. Where's my turquoise gone? There it is. Let's get a little bit more paint. Just see if we can encourage it to do something. Little things are happening, not too much. Okay. But this is a really good way of seeing also what they look like next to each other. Which is also really good. What I might try and do now is paint an inner circle on a couple of them. Let's get some more paint going. Oops, that was my mistake. I've gone into the wrong colour there. Just wash off your brush. It doesn't matter, you know, this is an experiment. So just thickening this paint in the middle. And what I want to do is see how the dioxazine violet mixes with that colour. So just put a dot in the centre, see if that will draw out. Let's do the same here as well. See if we can get something happening. So this isn't really kind of going to plan, if I'm honest, but it's an opportunity to have a play. So let's get some more of the permanent rose. See if we can encourage that to splay out. See what happens. The other thing you can do as well is actually lay down some colour . Give that a few minutes to dry and work on glazes. So I might come across with, say, the turquoise and just see what a glaze of turquoise halfway over would look like. So that's something I could look at in a moment. So I might do that with let's do a thin wash with the sap green in the other corner, because I've got some space to play with here. It's just a really good opportunity just to have a play, you know, there's no rules here. Safe place to paint. And if it doesn't work, it's fine, it's not a problem at all. You just move on to the next thing. So I'm going to let them dry and maybe come back in a few minutes and do a glaze over the top and see what happens. So for my third warm-up, I'm going to ditch the brushes and have a really good play with lots of different items that you might have. So the first one is a sponge brush. The second one is a nibbed pen that you might use for calligraphy. I have a palette knife, a sponge, a toothpick or a cocktail stick, and this I've just put together with a few strands of wool and clipped it with one of these clips just to secure it together, and just see what marks we can create, and just see what overall effect we can get with these different tools rather than using a brush. Okay, so I'm going to use the same colours that I had in my palette before, just because they're in there and I want to use them up, don't want to waste them. It's always a really good tip. I often don't clean my palette. It's really good when you're playing just to use up bits of paint that are left. So I'm going to make a start by using the sponge brush. So this has a chiselled edge to it, so you can get some nice straight lines with that. Let's start with the magenta. And because it's a sponge, it will soak up quite a bit of paint. And let's see what marks I can create. So just by dragging that across the surface, I can create these nice straight thin lines. And it does hold quite a lot of paint actually, it's still leaving a nice mark. You don't have quite as much control with this as you do with a brush, so I'm getting some lovely edges actually, which are really nice. So let's just make a few more marks. I can also make bigger marks by dragging, and because I've not reloaded the brush, the sponge, it's giving a kind of a dry brush effect. That's really nice. Let's have a look at something else. Let's have a go with the palette knife next. Now, what I want to do is pick up some of this lovely green, sap green. I'm just going to scrape it across the surface there and push my palette knife into the paint. And it's picking up just for kind of random bits. The other way you can do it is actually, I've seen people pick up paint with a brush and then wipe it onto a palette knife like that, just to kind of load it up. Okay, let's have quite a bit of paint on there first and see what happens. So first of all, I'm going to scrape downwards. So it's just the edge that's coming off. If I hold it flat, maybe I can get, yeah, look at that, a lovely strong mark there. I like that, that's nice. Okay, so that's great. Also, you can create lines similar to this by using the edge of the palette knife. You can get these very fine, thin marks. Let's come across over that purple. So these are really nice actually. These would be great effects as any kind of straight lines if you're doing fencing or something like that. In a landscape, you could get these lovely marks here, or rigging on a boat, that would be good for that. That's really quite pretty, I like that. Let's have a play next. Let's go for the sponge. Now this is just a cut up ordinary kitchen sponge. I've just snipped into it. You can make a lot of textures. You can pull bits off with your fingers, just pinch bits off like that, and you'll get a much more textured surface to your sponge. Oops. So once you're happy that you've got a kind of, not a flat, because what would happen is if I didn't pinch it out and I just placed it down like that, I just get a square shape, which is okay, you might want that, but I want something completely different. So let's go in, or let's go for the dark colour. So let's go into the dark Zine Violet there. you can see that it's only picked up the paint on certain areas, so we're going to get a lovely texture here. So I'm just going to dab that down. That's great. This is good for foliage and things like that, maybe snow or spray on a wave in the sea. That would be lovely. That's really pretty, that's worked lovely. Let's pick some more up. And let's go over again, so you can layer this up and really create lovely marks. That's beautiful actually. So let's put that one to the side. And what I want to do is, let's have a go with the wool. I've not tried this before, so this will be interesting. Actually, I'm going to need a little bit more water. Let's try the turquoise. Added a bit more water in there, because this really does need to soak up that paint. Let's dip that right in. I've picked up a little bit of crimson off the side there, but that's fine. Okay, so I've got some paint on there, and if we just dab it or flick it, and that's creating a lovely, again, you would never be able to create these marks with an ordinary paintbrush. Let's pinch it together a little bit more. Just tighten it up a little bit. Let's go into, let's mix some of these colours together and add a bit more water. Let's see what we can do over here. So it's just making kind of random marks really. You could drag it. Quite like that. That's nice. Okay, so very random. You're not going to have as much control with the marks that you make with something like this, but that can be quite fun. Now we've got a toothpick and we have the pen nib. These are going to create similar marks. It's quite difficult with the toothpick to get a long mark because it only holds a very small amount of paint. And similarly, it might be easier actually to pick up the paint. Let's get some more of that violet. To pick up the paint, taking it onto the pick with a brush so you can really load it up. And let's just see. Oops, that's created a blob, that's okay. Let's drag that out to see how far. Now this also scratches the surface of the paper, so just be aware of that. If you put some pressure on it, it will scratch that surface, and then any paint you lay on the top will then soak into that surface. So for example, if I scratch into this up here, just make some random scratches, and then go in with, let's just make a pale mix of colour, pale mix of purple. Take some of that off my brush. Oops, got some fibres from the wool there. And then if you just brush across those marks, you can see it reveals those lines that I've created there. I hope you can see that on the camera. But yeah, if you do that, you can actually then see those marks, those scratches on the surface. Bear in mind, obviously, if you scratch the surface of your paper, then you can't remove that afterwards. So if that's the effect you want, you really need to plan ahead and make sure the marks that you place down are exactly where you want them. But I like the way it's actually dragged the paint around from this spot. That's really nice. If I use the side of the toothpick, you can get slightly wider marks. Oops. Let's load it up with a brush. So this really is playing around now, so you can have some fun with those. And then the nib is very similar. Let's get a different colour going. We're not going to see purple on there. There's a lot of purple. Let's get some permanent magenta on this nib. So I'm just using my brush again just to get some paint on there. And with this you've got more precision. I'm going across into a wet area of paint, so it should drag the pen, it's not coming off actually, it doesn't want to come off on the wet bit. You've got some lovely control over what marks you make with this. Let's get some more paint on it. I mean, you've got to be patient with something like this though, because we really aren't making very big marks. They're tiny, tiny, but it might be good to represent maybe sort of woolen fabric on a woolly jumper. I'm making tiny little circles here, and you can build up those lines, those marks. If I hold this up to the camera in a second, you'll be able to see some of these little marks that I'm making. Again, just play with anything you have. I'm just making some little circles where I can. Let's do some purple. It's a bit wet. It doesn't want to come off on the damp paper, so you do need to use this on dry paper. So if I show you what that has all created, hopefully you're going to be able to see this. Okay, so I have lots of texture happening in there, which I think is quite fun. So you could take any one of those elements and put it in a painting, make something really quite abstract and quite dynamic. So that's worked out really well. And the next warm-up I'm going to show you is basically making marks without touching the paper, which is quite interesting. Right, so the last of my warm-ups is all about creating areas of paint without actually physically touching the painting at all. So that might sound really confusing or complicated, but it's really not, and it's very fun. So let's make a start. I've cleaned my palette off. I wanted to use some colours, some warmer colours in this one. So I've got a brown, which I never use a pre-mixed brown usually in my paintings, but a lot of sets come with a brown in them, so I thought, let's give that a go. It's an opportunity to try it out. I've got my warm cadmium orange and cadmium red already mixed. And to start off with, okay, I am going to touch the paper with a brush, but this is the only time I'm going to do it. So I'm taking my Dollar & Rowney round wash brush. It's got real hairs in it, and I'm just going to dip it in some clean water, and I'm going to, because this holds a lot of water, this makes this easier, just going to drag some water across the surface in different directions, make a bit of a pattern if you like on the surface, and if it puddles up in a few areas that's fine, but basically I'm making a lot of little lines that join up, but I'm not completely covering the page. That's the only time I'm going to physically touch the surface of the painting. So now I've got a clean brush here, and let's start off with, let's go for the lovely yellow. This is a gorgeous yellow to use as well. So I'm really loading up my brush. I'm just going to touch the end, just the very, very tip. I'm not controlling anything else, I'm just touching it to somewhere where I can see the water. If I physically didn't want to touch it, I could also just tap the top of the brush. So I'm not actually touching it at all here, and I've no real control of where this paint's going to land. It's quite random, except obviously I can move my hand across the piece and have an element, I suppose, there of control. So you can see where it's landing in the wet paper and then sort of going down that channel of water. Wash my brush again, and let's try the red. Let's use the brown last. Let's try the red. Let's do the same thing again. just tapping down. Let's have the red on this side. Can you see I've got my paintbrush angled towards the paper and I'm using a firm tap with my finger. Now the paint is very wet, my brush is absolutely soaking with that paint, and that way it comes off your brush much easier. I do see people struggling with this sometimes, and it's quite simple, but a very firm dab with your finger on the top and it will come off. Clean my brush again. This time go into the brown. I've mixed up quite a lot of pigment in here, so it should be a nice saturated colour. Same again, but I'm going to go on this side of the paper. Whoops. You can't fully control it, as you can see, so I've got some paint on that other section there. Never mind. After all, we're just playing. Let's see what happens here. So some of it's landing on the wet areas and some of it's landing on the dry areas. Let's leave it at that. So now the next thing I want to do is do tilting and tipping and allow this to move about on the surface and see what happens. So the paint's going to start sort of mixing together a little bit. We can tap the board to encourage it to move, and it's just finding the channels of water that we put down before. Okay, we can blow. Which is really effective. I can also use my spray bottle and squirt more water on the surface, and this is really going to allow it to move about. Okay, so it's sort of all the colours really pretty much now have come together. So finally I'm going to go back into, let's go back into the red. And dab into that. Really, let's get that going. And then the other thing I'm going to do is drip on, or sprinkle on should I say, a little bit of salt, but I'm going to let this dry for a minute or two first. I don't want it to be too wet when I go in with the salt, so I'm going to give this a minute or two to dry, and then I'll show you sprinkling the salt in a second. So I've left the painting for a couple of minutes and I've fetched my salt. It is just table salt, ordinary table salt, it doesn't need to be anything special. And I'm going to use just a few grains of salt. There's not a lot there, and I might not even use all of that, it's a very small area. So I'm going to take some of that salt in between my finger and thumb, and from a height, and just letting some of those grains hit the surface. And that's all I'm going to do. There's plenty of salt on there to create a lovely effect. You can see that I haven't used it all, so don't go crazy. If you use too much salt, it's going to soak up all of the paint and you'll be left with next to nothing on there. So now we've just got to let it do its thing, really. We've got time to have a cup of tea or whatever we want to do, read a book, and come back maybe in half an hour to an hour's time and see what happens. I've sat my painting, now it's dry, and released the tape from around it. I've raised it up onto a box for you so that you can see a clearer picture of it. I've rubbed away the salt from my final painting now that it's dry, and that worked out really nicely. I think it's quite naturalistic. The textures that the salt created are very subtle, so that could work well in a woodland, especially autumn colours. It creates a sort of effect, maybe leaves on the ground or something like that. So that worked out really nicely. The previous experiment or warm-up that we did, which was all about mark making and using things other than a brush, that's also worked out really well. I love the contrast between the different marks. It's a really pretty abstract painting, actually. If I enlarged it, I wouldn't mind having that displayed on my wall. I think what's successful about it is the scratches that we created using the cocktail stick. That works really nicely. Very precise, very fine detail you can create using that method. I also really love the marks that I created using the sponge. Of all kind of the simple household objects that you have hanging around, that is a really useful tool for creating this kind of natural layering effect. So that was successful. Moving on to the second of the warm-ups that we did. So this was originally supposed to be colours blending together from one circle to the next, but actually it wasn't very successful. But that was okay because I moved on and actually thought about layering the paint more rather than getting them to blend together while they're wet. So instead I started to use what we call a glazing technique. So on top of the shapes I've layered patches of thin colour, and what you have to do is you have to ensure the first layer has dried fully before you apply the second layer. So you can see that just layering up these different colours on top will give you a slightly muted tone, and it's a really nice experiment to do just to see how the different colours work together and what you can create that way. And finally, the first warm-up we did here was simply playing with two colours and seeing what we could create. So I chose the cerulean blue and the alizarin crimson. The crimson is really overpowering this, but then again I really like just the odd bright blue section that's coming through, so that's worked nicely. I also like the effect of that quick spray of water that we did right at the end of that warm-up. It's created these random blobs, lighter kind of spidery blobs, which is really cool. I also like the really subtle areas that we're getting here and there, so that's something that I might utilise in a painting. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed this video with me. Hopefully it's got your creative juices flowing. It should boost your confidence. Remember, absolutely no rules, so therefore no pressure. And you know, mistakes, they don't matter here. It's completely guilt-free. It's a brilliant way to start your painting, just to get you warming up. Okay, I hope you join me again soon for another video. Take care, everybody. Thank you.